again for taking the time to join us for our webinar today on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldariaga, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. We're going to spend some time today talking about the TN visa. This is one of the most common visas that our firm assists clients with. And specifically, we're going to talk through the TN visa requirements and the question of sponsorship and the employer's responsibilities regarding the TN visa. This is a question that's often raised by employers. It's one that we do get a lot. A few items before we get started. Some of you might know that the founder of our firm, Ian Scott, was actually on a TN visa for a decade before he actually got on an E2 visa, which is what he's currently on and what he started our firm on. But before that, he was on the TN visa for a decade. And so he actually navigated this process a number of times as he initially applied for it and then renewed it. And really his experience navigating that process really does inform how we work with our clients and really do take a client-centered approach. And we try to always see the process through our clients' eyes to make it as seamless as possible. Our firm is, however, a full-service immigration firm, although we do handle TN visas very frequently. We also handle E2 visas frequently, as well as other immigrant investor and entrepreneur visas, as well as family visas, and we handle humanitarian law as well. So any and all immigration-related issues, we are equipped, prepared, and eager to help with, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can be of any assistance. This webinar is part of an ongoing series. We try to do at least 2 webinars a month, and we will be continuing to do that. So after this webinar, we'll send you a link where you can sign up for those future webinars. We'll send you a PowerPoint presentation, the one that you see on your screen. We'll share a comprehensive TN visa guide that we've prepared, as well as a link to this recording. This presentation is being recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to send it to us either through the chat function or the Q&A function of Zoom. And I'll be monitoring that. I have it on my screen. I'll be actively monitoring it. And either we'll answer your question immediately if it's relevant to what we're talking about, or we may save it for the end, but we will cover the questions. So please share them with us. We're very fortunate to have my colleague, John Barrera, who's also a senior associate here today to speak. John has significant experience with all sorts of immigration related issues, including TN visas. So without further ado, I will pass it off to you, John.
Excellent. Thank you, Dustin, and good morning to everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about the TN visa. I'll be covering many of the requirements and some other details. And to start with, let's talk about how you will qualify for a TN visa. The first thing you need to know is that you must be a citizen of either Canada or Mexico. So the TN visa is specific to those 2 countries. Now, the TN visa is subject to specific professions that will appear on a list of professions that are provided within the TN regulations. So there is an actual list. The list will be specific and showing what occupations or professions will qualify, and they will list the eligibility requirements for each profession. To note, most, not all, require at least a bachelor's degree. Some require some level of education plus a time frame of work experience, and there are a few that probably don't require any kind of experience at all. You could look that up. You could probably Google NAFTA TN job list, and you could look at those jobs and those requirements for each job or occupation. You must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. So we went over that. As I stated, those are listed in that list, the education and combination of work experience. You must have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the U.S. So we'll go over this a little bit more later on. You don't really need a petitioner for this case. but you do need an employer that's willing to hire you for one of those occupations. So you do have to have a prearranged agreement with an employer in order to qualify. And the job, essentially, you need to be working in that in duties that are based on those professional activities. So you can't really be going outside the typical job duties for one of those listed professions. The government goes by certain guides that are available online as well. One of them is called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. That's online, and that'll give the job duties for each type of job that's listed in that TN list. So you can look at that as well to see what are the typical job duties for that qualifying position. So let's look at what sponsorship looks like. So you're not looking at a case that's sort of like one of the other employment visa categories, sort of like an H-1B or an L visa, where you actually need the employer to petition for you. So there's no required actual filing for a USCIS form. And the TNs are not specific to a location. You're not going to be subject to, again, the kind of those requirements under the other employment visa categories, like a specific wage for a position and everything. Essentially, these cases are a bit more informal. You're looking at in most cases, if you're Canadian, you're going to be filing at a port of entry. So with a border checkpoint officer, and there are pre-designated border entries where you will be applying for or in. For Mexicans, it's a bit different because you're actually going to be applying through a consulate. So you can't just show up at one of those pre-clearance or border checkpoints to apply for the visa. You actually have to go through the application process, filing what's called the DS-160 with the consulate. If you are going to be filing with USCIS, an actual immigration form, it's because you're in the United States on another status and you're going to be changing status to a TN, or you have a TN and you're looking to extend status within the United States. But if you're outside the US, again, Canada, you're going to be going to a border checkpoint, submitting the application with the officer, and the officer will review it and then issue a decision and hopefully the visa or admit you into the US under TN status. Mexicans, you will be applying through a consulate. Consular officer will review the case after the formal application is filed, and if he approves it, he'll issue a visa stamp into the passport, and then with that you could enter the US through a border checkpoint. Yeah. So moving on. So I guess I already covered this, but there's some more to cover here. So what are the differences between Canadians and Mexicans? So Canadians, again, one of the main differences, you can apply at a port of entry. The visas can be issued for up to 3 years. If you're a spouse of a Canadian, if you're a spouse but you're not Canadian, you'll have to go to a consulate to get that version of the spousal visa, which is a TD visa, stamped into the visa to be able to come in as a dependent of the primary TN applicant. Mexicans, as I stated before, you're applying at a U.S. consulate. You'll get an actual visa stamp. Actually, now I believe they're issuing those visas for up to 4 years. So you'll have that visa for 4 years, and then with that, you get into the United States. As I indicated before, if you're looking to extend your status or renew, you could do that through USCIS if you want, or if not, then you could go through, again, if Canadian, through a port of entry, or through Mexico through a consulate. So I think that'll cover my portion of the presentation, and I'll be turning it over to Dustin.
Great, thank you, John. Great information. And I do see that one participant has raised their hand. So if you do have a question, please do send it in through either the question and answer function or the chat function. So Samantha, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Thank you for your question. On job applications, the question is always, do you require sponsorship? If we intend to come in under a TN, does this mean the answer would be yes to that question? Is TN considered sponsorship per se? John, I don't know if you want to answer that. I'm also happy to answer it, but I'll defer to you. Oh, John, I think you're muted.
Absolutely. Sorry about that.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And you could chime in as well. So it is sort of a sponsorship because you need the employer to have a job waiting for you if the TN visa is approved. The distinction with other, like I stated before, with other employment-based visa cases is that they're not actually petitioning for you. So you know, I mean, we use the term sponsor. I think it's more of a term of art in these kind of cases. Whereas when you're looking at a case, an employment case which requires a petitioner is a petitioner in the legal aspect of a case. So here in a TN, I mean, you know, if you look at what the employer is doing, he is sort of sponsoring you for that TN visa because he's going to give you the job. But I think it's important to understand that he's not actually petitioning for you like in other cases.
Right. So I actually shared in the chat a link to our blog post. Like I said, this is a very common question that we get. I think, and by the way, I should say that we're happy to talk with employers as well. So when someone approaches us asking us to help prepare a TN visa application, sometimes the individual wants us to only interact with them as the employee, in which case that's fine. We can work with them. They will then speak with their employer and gather the necessary information, and we'll prepare the application that way. But sometimes our client, the employee of the company, will say, I want you to work directly with my employer, and we're happy to do that as well. And so something that does come up a lot is if the employer is saying we don't want to sponsor, quote unquote, sponsor an employee, we are happy to talk with them and explain really what the difference is between a TN visa and something like an H-1B. So sponsorship, usually what employers are thinking of, it's helpful to define what they mean by sponsorship. Usually what they mean is something like the H-1B context. If you're sponsoring an employee in the H-1B context, you have to pay a prevailing wage, which is almost always higher than the minimum wage. You also are prohibited from what's called benching the employee, bringing them into the US and not employing them. So you can be required to pay back wages if you do that on an H-1B. Also on an H-1B, and I say H-1B, there are all other work visas that have those requirements. The TN does not, and I'll get to that in a moment. But other requirements are if the employee is terminated, the employer may need to pay for them to be for their transportation back to their home country. None of those requirements apply to the TN. For a TN visa, and what we explain to employers, the employer has no obligation to pay a prevailing wage. Their requirement is to pay the minimum wage. They also are under no obligation to keep the employee employed for a certain period of time. The employee is an at-will employee, meaning that the employee can quit whenever they want, and the employer can fire them whenever they want. So the employer has a lot of flexibility and freedom on a TN visa. Now, what John was referring to is that if an individual is applying for TN status within the US, the employer does need to sign that petition, that application, the I-129, and would represent that they are applying on behalf of the employee. That doesn't actually come with many obligations, though. The filing the petition does not require the employer to pay a specific amount, does not require them to keep them employed. It really is just their signature on the petition representing that they do intend to employ the person when the person's status is approved. If, on the other hand, as John has gone over, if the employee is applying at either a consulate or at the border, that employee is the one filing the application. It is not the employer. And so the employee would be filing the application, would have a letter from the employer essentially explaining what the job entails, what the pay would be. Again, it's not binding, but it is representing to the government that that's the intention of the agreement. So as I hope you can tell, the obligations on the employer are minimal in the TN context. And I think, Samantha, to answer your question directly, if I were an employee, a prospective employee, and the employer said, do you require sponsorship? I would ask them what they mean by sponsorship. And I would be very clear that a TN visa does not have the same obligations as something like an H-1B, which is probably what they have in mind. And if they have further questions, we are happy to get on a consultation or to be engaged to work with you and your employer to sort that out. We actually do it quite frequently. It's a great question. And again, as you can tell from the title of this presentation, it kind of is at the heart of what one of the items we wanted to convey today. So thank you for the question. So I do see a few more questions that I'll touch on real quick. Do you guys help IT consultants get the job and place it for TN? We do not help with job placement. We are immigration lawyers, so essentially what we do is we are approached by either an employer or an employee that has the offer in place, and we structure the application, assist with drafting of the employer letter, and gathering the required materials for the application. But we are not in the role of placing anyone for jobs. And in terms of the specific role of IT consultant, I would echo what John went over before, which is that for any role where you're interested in getting a TN visa, step one is always to go to the regulations. If you Google TN NAFTA regulations and you go to the first link, it should be a link to the regulations. And if you look at the regulations, you will see a list of the available jobs, the variety of job titles. You must fall within one of these job titles in order to be eligible for a TN visa. So, you know, go deeper than your title. So you said IT consultant. If you don't see IT consultant on the list, which I'm fairly certain you're not going to find IT consultant on the list, look at your job duties. What will you actually be doing as an IT consultant? Does it fall within another job that's actually listed on the list of TN regulations? So computer systems analyst is on the list, for example. You know, so you have to think that way and really see what your job duties are, match them to the job title that's in the TN regulations. And also, as John had said before, really the key resource to figure out what those job duties are that the government is looking for is what's called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So again, you know, if you go to Google and you Google Occupational Outlook Handbook, computer systems analyst, what you're going to get is a description of what the government thinks a computer systems analyst does. So in response to this, the question that's been submitted, you know, is IT consultant a job that's eligible? I would recommend going through the TN regulations, seeing what job title sounds closest to that of IT consultant, going to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and seeing what those job duties are that the government thinks a computer systems analyst would do, and seeing if they're close to the role you'd have as IT consultant. And from that point, you may need to work with your employer to say, hey, my duties actually need to be more aligned with a computer systems analyst. Could I do job duties more aligned with that so that we could frame this within the framework of what the government would accept for a TN visa application? But that's kind of the process that we go through and we help our clients with. And if you were doing it on your own, that's the process we would recommend that you go through as well. And John, please feel free to dive in if you have anything else to add. I'm going to look at a few more questions. I'm not sure the question from Manuel, if IT, could I work on another field, have another degree? I have 2 degrees. Okay. I believe, Manuel, I believe you're asking about how the degree would relate. John, do you want to talk about that? I think what Manuel's asking is, and let me know if you interpret this question differently. How closely the degree needs to match to the job. Yeah, do you want to answer that? Oh, John, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Sure. Yeah. The main thing with the degree is that you have to make sure. I mean, the minimum when there's a degree requirement is probably going to be a bachelor's degree, right? That's really what you're focusing on. And then it's really about the job duties of the position being offered, where your degree is related to those duties. So if it's more of an engineering type position, then they're going to be expecting an engineering degree. Like a liberal arts or degree is probably not going to hack it in that type of situation. So it's matching the degree to the job duties, and working to see if those job duties can be made. Again, like Dustin had mentioned, going into the occupational handbook, seeing what that typical position requires, those job duties, and hope and seeing if the job that you're being offered matches that type of position, and then matching it up with the degree that you have.
Perfect. And I know a number of questions have rolled in. I'm going to go ahead and continue with the presentation because I think a few of these will be answered as we continue through the presentation, and then anything we don't touch on, we'll definitely answer at the end. We do have time, and I think we'll have time left over for questions. So let's talk a bit about difficult TN categories, specifically management consultants and economists. These are 2 of the most challenging TN visa categories. We handle these cases frequently, but there are certain things you absolutely need to keep in mind for these. Management consultant category. This is one of the most challenging categories, in part because it's one of the few TN job titles or professions that you don't need a college degree for. So, if someone is a Canadian or a Mexican national and they want a TN visa and they didn't go to college, or they don't have a professional degree, a post-secondary diploma or a post-secondary certificate, then this is one of the few options that they have. So you do find a lot of people kind of falling into this category who don't necessarily qualify for it. The government knows that, so the government will heavily scrutinize any application that falls within the management consulting category. Now, if you're coming to the US to actually work for a management consulting firm, those applications are not especially risky. What are risky is if you're coming to the US in the management consulting role, TN role, to provide services for a company that is not a management consulting firm. The example that I like to use is, let's say that there is an expert, national of Canada. He or she is an expert in solar panels. And there is a US company that manufactures solar panels that needs a consultant to come in and essentially consult on the supply chain and advise them on how to expand their market, how to improve their operations, etc. So the employer would be a solar panel company in the US. It would not be a consulting firm like McKinsey, BCG, Bain, any of these. Those are the cases where these applications are challenging. So let's talk a bit about the requirements. So the management consultant, you can qualify either with, let's actually pull up the regulations. What it says is that you can qualify with a baccalaureate degree, a licenciatura degree, or equivalent professional experience attesting to 5 years as a management consultant. So that would be if you've actually been a management consultant, or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. And that latter part, that 5 years of experience in a relevant field is why I like the example of a solar panel expert. So they would have 5 years of experience with solar panels, and they're coming to the US to provide consulting services based on that. So essentially, in order, the kind of the pitfalls, if you're applying for this category, are a few. First of all, it is critical to very specifically define what you are coming to the US to do. So again, this is not talking about a management consultant working for Bain, BCG, McKinsey, or another consulting firm. That's fine. You would just say, I'm coming to the US to work as a management consultant, as a full-time employee for that company. That's fine, not especially risky. However, if you are that solar panel expert, what you want to do is work with the prospective employer and very specifically define what the challenge is that the employer is facing. You then want to very specifically explain why the applicant is the person who's qualified to assist with that challenge. And you want to narrowly define the period of time that they're needed. And the reason for all of this is because what the government's really looking for, kind of the flag that they have in mind, is they will not admit someone who appears to be coming in to fill a permanent role. So for example, if that solar panel company has, an internal role where someone kind of advises on their supply chain, that application is very likely to be denied if the government thinks that the TN applicant is coming to fill that permanent role. So you want to make it very clear, they're not filling a permanent role. They're actually coming in to address a very specific, discrete, and temporary problem that once it's addressed, the company will move on, the consultant's no longer needed. And that's kind of how consultants work, right? They're engaged for a set period of time. You don't hire a consultant indefinitely. You hire a consultant to address a specific problem, and that's what the government's looking for. Otherwise, other ways you can strengthen an application are having an actual consulting agreement where the outside of the letter that the company would sign, and that we typically help prepare, that explains, the TN regulations, the job title, the pay, all of these things. In addition to that, we would recommend a contract between the company and the employee or independent contractor. I'll get into that in a minute. That explains the scope of work and the amount of time it would take. Again, that serves to show they're not coming as a permanent employee. They're coming for a temporary engagement. Also, paying the individual a salary can be a flag, because that suggests a permanent role. Hourly wages are easier to explain for a limited engagement for a consultant. So, and finally, it is an option to frame the person as an independent contractor. They don't actually need to be an employee of the US company. So, you can say that this is an individual who's coming in as an independent contractor. They could even have their own consulting, sole proprietorship in Canada or in Mexico, and they're coming to the US to give those services to a US employer. That's fine too. But a number of pitfalls for the management consultant category. So, maybe the most valuable takeaway is these are, situations where we do recommend that you work with a lawyer. They're thorny and they're nuanced. Many of the other TN categories, it's not, it's oftentimes not necessary to work with a lawyer. You always can, and it's usually beneficial to. But other categories tend to be more straightforward. The management consulting category is one where a lawyer really can add value to the application. Second, the economist category. The reason this category is tricky is because in 2017, the government actually issued a policy statement saying that financial analysts and market research analysts are not considered economists for TN visa purposes. So before 2017, people would come in and they'd be working as financial analysts or as market research analysts, and they'd say, I'm coming in as an economist, and it might be approved. The government defines financial analysts essentially as those who are looking for opportunities to make profits through investments. Market research analysts are really those who help companies with marketing. If you want to know more, do a search on the Occupational Outlook Handbook for each of those job titles, financial analysts and market research analysts, and you'll see, what those job titles are. But also make sure to do a search for economists, because if you want to come in on a TN visa as an economist, you want to spend time on the Occupational Outlook Handbook and get a very good sense of what the government thinks an economist should do. Apply microeconomic theory, macroeconomic theory, use quantitative research to analyze segments of the market. Opportunities for expansion can be a part of that for a company. So there are ways that you can kind of tailor your job into the economist category. But you have to be very thoughtful about it, because the government is keeping an eye out to make sure that economists are doing duties that the government thinks economists should do. And again, I hope it goes without saying, for any of these applications, you always must be honest. Never make a misrepresentation to the government. So if the job you're wanting to perform in the US is not consistent with the job duties on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you either have to work with the employer to kind of make sure you can change your job duties, your actual job duties, or that job category is just not a good fit for you. You may need to look for another category, but we would always say, these applications, you do have to be honest. You do have to be honest in them. So let's move to the next one. The TN application process explained. I really don't think there's much I have to add to this. I think John covered everything here.
Perhaps just highlight kind of like the difference of the letter, where you present the letter at the port of entry, as opposed to the consular side, where it's an actual form that you've sent online.
Oh, yeah. Right. So basically, if you are, so Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico cannot submit an initial TN application at a port of entry. They must go to a consulate. So, and Canadians can go to a consulate, but there's very few reasons why they would. One of the few is if they have a partner, a spouse, who is not a national of Canada. That there it would make sense if they both wanted to go to the consulate together. But what we see in practice is that nationals of Mexico apply at a consulate, nationals of Canada apply at the border. So the application is slightly different, as John said. If you're applying at a consulate, your first step is really to submit a form DS-160. It's an online form. And when you go for your TN interview, you would bring the supporting documentation. The supporting documentation is really all you would bring if you're a national of Canada and you're applying at the border. And so what that application packet looks like is, it's going to be obviously your passport. It's going to be a letter from the employer that explains the TN profession that you're applying under, your expected pay, your job duties, a little bit about the employer, information about the applicant and their background and why they qualify for this TN visa category, the period of time that they'd be performing the duties, and that letter must have an original signature on it. It also must be on the employer's letterhead. That is critical because the government sees a lot of fraud in these applications, and we have heard too many stories, fortunately not from our clients, but of people submitting these applications, approaching a border with a signature that's not original and being rejected on that basis. You would also need, as part of your supporting documentation, proof that you qualify for the TN visa. That could be a degree. It could be professional experience, as we've talked about. You'd go onto the regulations, the TN regulations, you'd see, okay, I want to come in as, you pick the category, let's say economist. For an economist, all you need is a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So you'd need to provide in your supporting documentation proof that you have that degree. And that proof could be, would be your diploma, and it would need to be an original diploma. Again, no copies, the board's likely to reject it due to fraud, due to suspected fraud. So original documents are really key. John, was there anything else worth adding?
Just to clarify, because I may have confused some people on this. In either situation, whether you're applying with the consulate or if you're from Mexico, or you're applying at a port of entry if you're Canadian, the heart of the case is always going to be that employer letter. You're going to require them in both situations. The difference, as myself and Dustin had highlighted, is that with Mexico, you have kind of like that additional step where you have to file that formal DS-160 in addition to the letter. Whereas at the port of entry for a Canadian, you don't have to file that DS-160. It's just, making the arrangement to show up at the port of entry and presenting the letter with the supporting documentation.
Perfect. All right, so some tips and common TN visa pitfalls. These are just helpful tips that we've learned through our practice, and we've seen clients encounter. It's always important to call the port of entry ahead of time, just to make sure, A, that they are currently processing TN visas, and B, to figure out if there are any unique aspects of the process. They might tell you, well, we're processing them within certain hours. They might say, make sure you use the entrance on this side of the building. Especially during COVID, ports of entry started implementing unique requirements. So go onto the Customs and Border Protection CBP website, get the phone number for the port of entry, give them a call ahead of time, and just make sure you're all set. As I mentioned before, ensure that the employer contact, the person who signed the employer letter, is available and able to answer a call in case the border official calls them. Border officers do this. They'll see that the letter was signed by an HR representative. There will be a phone number there. They'll pick up the phone and call. You want to make sure that person picks up the phone. So just send them an email beforehand, the HR representative or the CEO, whoever signed the letter, and just say, I'm planning to approach the border, between 3 and 5 p.m. Tomorrow. If you could just have your phone nearby in case they call, that would be best. Bring your diploma, official transcripts, and original signed versions of the employer letter and experience letter if they're relevant. Again, ports of entry can be very strict about original signatures and original documents. So don't risk it by bringing a copy. Just get the original and take that with you. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. That means that when you apply for the visa, as well as when you enter the US on the visa, you cannot have the intention of applying for a green card on that visit. So essentially, how this plays out in practice is that border officers will sometimes, kind of scrutinize how long you've had the TN visa. If you've had it for, what we found is that if you've had it for fewer than, I'd say 5 years or so, you're probably not going to get many questions about your intention to remain in the US. But if you've renewed your TN, 3 times, 4 times, you might start getting questions about how long do you actually plan to remain in the US? Do you have an intention to adjust status? Do you own a house abroad? Do you have a bank account abroad? So, if you're nearing that 5-year point, it could be wise to preempt those questions and bring with you documentation that you have a lease abroad, that you have a bank account abroad, anything that really shows your ties to either Mexico or Canada. And with that, I will switch it to the questions. Let's see if I can successfully stop sharing this. My computer screen is acting funny. You know what? Let's just keep it open, and we'll just go ahead and talk through these questions. John, did you see any listed while I was talking that you wanted to dive into?
Um, sure. One of the initial questions is asking about whether there are specific land border entries that can issue the TN visa.
Perfect. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I think my feeling on that is that there is a sort of like a preference with port of entries. That's why I believe Dustin mentioned you should call in first and with a specific port of entry, sorry, and ask them if they will take the application and if there are any like nuanced requirements that they may have at that port of entry.
Right. And we do work with clients depending on your application, such as if you have a management consultant application, we will work with the client to figure out which port of entry is ideal. So that is a good question, and I agree with John. At will employment is all risk for the employee. Not necessarily. At will employment is kind of the standard in the US. The employee can leave at any time as well. So essentially you can quit whenever you want and the employer can let you go whenever you want. So that's the nature of at-will employment. Let's see, Samantha, what do you recommend as ways to increase one's odds for a job through the TN if you click yes on the application itself? I mean, again, if you see a job where they say no sponsorship, I think it's worthwhile talking with the employer and really explaining to them that this is not traditional sponsorship like it would be for an H-1B. And again, we're happy to talk with the employer if that's helpful. Can you explain the third point under management consultant, extra role supernumerary? This is what I was talking about before. You cannot be coming in as a management consultant to fill a permanent role. You need to be coming in as a consultant. So it's not a role that the employer had that they're filling. They really have a problem that they need to address. And once you address it, you're leaving. John, did you see any others that I haven't been able to keep up with? There have been great questions rolling in.
So there's a similar question we had before. Does the TN for engineer occupation require the bachelor's degree to be in the same field as the TN job that the visa is applied for? I have bachelor's degree in civil engineering and 15 years of work experience in the civil engineering field. I recently earned a master's degree in software engineering in the US, and now I am looking to change my profession from civil to software engineering. Will I be qualified for a TN visa for an IT job while my bachelor is in the non-IT field? I could take an initial crack on this. It's a bit of I think it's a bit of a complicated answer to a great question. Typically we should probably sit down with you and just go over kind of like the facts of the situation, your degree, also the job, just to see how we can make it work. But in attempting to answer the question, the first thing I think you need to look at is, do you have the degree? The regulations are very specific that all you need for an engineering position is the actual degree. So then if you meet that, which you do here in this case, now we go into the more maybe complex and nuanced issue of whether the job duties for the position are relevant to the degree that you have. So then that's where we have to kind of be careful, as Dustin related previously. We don't want to misrepresent anything in the application, but we want to see if the employer is actually married to the description and duties of that position. Is there flexibility with framing the duties with your actual experience and degree to make them coincide better? But again, I mean, the job is the job, the duties are the duties eventually for that position. At some point there won't be flexibility, and it could be that it's not going to work for your degree. But again, I always look at first, do you have the degree? If you have the degree, we have something to work with. Now it's to kind of match those duties within that position to the relevant experience and degree that you have, to see if it's going to work out.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And there's a similar question. I'm an industrial, oh, sorry. What if the major in your bachelor and master studies is in mechanical, presumably engineering, but your current role is as IT consultant? So related to what John was saying, ideally the degree, if a degree is required for the role, would explicitly be the same as the job. So if you're applying to be an economist, you have a degree in economics. If you don't have a degree that is a degree in economics, it is possible, if you have a related field, such as maybe math, what you would want to do at that point is provide your transcript, and you would want to do a detailed explanation in your application, explaining why you're qualified, going through the coursework you've completed that shows that even though you have a math degree, you did a lot of coursework in economics. So it is still possible to qualify on that basis. Robert asked, I'm an industrial engineer and also have an MBA. Would that help me, or would it look overqualified? So the way this works is the government lists what's required. So let's go back to economist, baccalaureate degree. It is what the government's looking for is a degree, at least a baccalaureate degree, could be a master's, could be a PhD in economics. If you have that, you qualify based on the fundamental, threshold requirement. Let's say that you have a degree, a bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in economics. That's fine for the economist category. A master's degree is senior to a bachelor's degree. But let's say that you have a bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in business administration. That's trickier. Your bachelor's degree is not going to qualify. It's in English. Even if you took economics coursework, that's a hard sell. English is not related to economics on the face of it. The MBA could get you to the economist role. You would have to look at your coursework and you'd have to point to economics coursework that qualifies you for a job as an economist. So again, you have to look under the hood of the degree and really make the argument that even though you don't have an economics degree, you have completed the coursework that qualifies you to be an economist. Again, that's riskier than having a bachelor's degree in economics, which on the face of it qualifies you for the TN category. And there's no real worry that you're overqualified. I have not seen that really be an issue. I think as long as the letter makes clear what role you're applying for and how you are ideally qualified for that role. So if the employer thinks you're a good fit, make sure that's represented in the letter. Let's see, John, did you see any others that you wanted to jump in on? That would be a good segue from what we've been talking about.
Let's see. Lily asked, I'm a dental assistant treatment coordinator. Do I qualify for a TN with a job offer in Florida? Again, you have to first look at the regulations. The basic way to look at this is my position listed within the positions listed in the regulations. You do have dentist as a qualifying position, but then it's going to require, if you look at it, it's going to require a degree in the dental field as a dentist, a DDS, DMD. It also mentions doctor in odontology, odontología for Mexicans, or doctor in cirugía dental, or state provincial license. So you have to look at, do I have that degree? If you don't, then it's going to probably be problematic. But then you could then look at what are the duties for that position being offered, and then look them up in the occupational outlook handbook see if you could find a position there that matches the duties, and then again, match. You go into the regulations and see if there's a job there that matches those duties. So that's kind of the way you have to kind of look at it when you have a situation where on the face of the position being offered, it doesn't quite look like you're going to qualify.
Right. So few questions I think we can address there. A few people are asking based on their specific circumstances. I have this degree. Would I qualify for this? Please schedule a consultation. The webinars are not really an opportunity to go into case-by-case questions. If you wanted to do the research on your own, you would look at the TN regulations. Look at the role you want to fill and see if you have the required degree or experience. If you do still have questions, please do schedule a consultation. I will actually put that in the comments right now, a link so that it's readily available. Okay. There were also a few questions. I really like these about working for multiple employers. You can work for multiple employers on a TN visa. I think it would be hard to work for 3, but 2 certainly. And basically, what you would need to submit 2 independent applications. It's called concurrent TN status. You would provide that information as you would for a normal application, either at the consulate for a national of Mexico, at the land border, port of entry for national of Canada. And you would essentially communicate to the officer, I'm applying for concurrent TN employment for 2 employers, and I have, essentially application packets for both. And you would get, if you're approved, you would get concurrent TN status, so you could work for both. I think one of the things you want to make sure to do in that case is logistically, it should make sense. So, if one of the employers is saying they're going to work for us for 50 hours a week or even 40 hours a week, and the other one is saying they're going to work for us for 40 hours a week, that could be a hard sell. It's hard to work that many hours. You certainly could, but just be ready to explain logistically how you're going to actually work for both employers. It might make more sense for each to be 20 hours a week. Part-time is fine for a TN visa, but the answer is yes, you can do concurrent employment. Another great question about a green card. You can transition from a TN to a green card by filing an adjustment of status. It's important that that a TN visa does not lead to a green card. It's not like a stepping stone to a green card, but if you're in the US on a TN visa and you qualify for a green card, such as through a family-based petition, that could be you have an immediate family member, a spouse, or employment-based. If your employer says, hey, we really like your work, we want to actually sponsor you for a green card, that's certainly possible. The most challenging part of that, though, is that, again, the TN visa and TN status is not dual intent. So as soon as you file a green card application, you will very likely face issues renewing your TN visa. So you need to be prepared for that, because as soon as you try to renew your TN visa, they're going to see you have a pending green card application, and you're going to have to overcome that suspicion that the government will have. Let's see.
I have a question. I don't think we're going to be able to answer it, but I think the question raises an issue that I think is important to cover. This is an anonymous. Hello, I got academic equivalency evaluation of foreign degree from Morningside and Spantran. Do you suggest any other agencies for evaluation of academic evaluation, as both my bachelor and master's are from India? Mm-hmm. So we don't really recommend specific evaluators. We'll work with you in terms of looking at whether the evaluation is appropriate for a case. But for the TN visa, what you need to look at is basically if the degree is from Canada, if you're Canadian, or if it's one of the NAFTA countries, right? Mexico, US, and Canada, you're not going to need an evaluation. But in this case, as this question poses, he does have a master's from another country, India. So he'll probably need an evaluation from that country in order to be able to move forward with that degree.
Exactly. And I know we have 5 minutes left. So John, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna try to fly through a few of these, if that's all right.
No worries.
Because I wanna get through these are great questions. All right, so I'm just gonna run down the list. A lot of jobs in the US have disclaimers saying you must be a resident or citizen. They don't do sponsorships. Is it worth it to apply anyways? I mean, I think it depends on the job. Again, engage in a discussion with the employer. Make sure they understand what sponsorship means. And if it's helpful to talk with us, we're always happy to do that. The TN visa allows you to work for 2 to 3 different companies. It does. We talked about that a moment ago. Temporary employment, can it be an independent contractor category rather than a permanent position? It can be. You can have a sole proprietorship or an LLC or a corporation in Canada or Mexico and be hired to do work in the US for a US employer. You cannot own the US company. So as it's fine for you to own the company in Canada or Mexico, you cannot own the US company. You will not be approved if the government knows that you own the US company that is seeking to employ you on a TN visa. I got a master's degree in the US. I'm a Canadian. Does the job have to be the same as the name on the TN list? It does not. What is important is the job duties. It could be easier if the job titles matched. It could avoid questions that the officer might have, but what's important is really the job duties. Are you doing job duties that are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook? Has the Economist guidance been reversed? It has not been, unfortunately. Would teller manager TD Bank be a considerable job? We would have to schedule a consultation to really get into the job duties there, or spend some time with the regulations to get a sense of it yourself. Ties to Europe, really the US wants to see that you have ties outside the US, because again, the concern is that you don't have sufficient ties outside the US, therefore you're likely to adjust status and seek a green card in the US. So you just want to be prepared to show ties outside the US. I have 12 years of renewing my TN visa. What if I want to move to another status to get, yeah, it's possible to move to another status to get permanent residence. For example, an H-1B is a dual intent visa. So if your employer wanted to sponsor you for an H-1B, you could do that. And then on an H-1B, you would have no problem with dual intent applying for a green card. So you can certainly do that, Manuel. I lived in the US on an L1 visa for 3 years. While there, we had 2 daughters. Congratulations. Would that be a risk? Probably not. The reason I say that is part of it depends on whether you're a national of Canada. If you're a national of Canada applying at a port of entry, the fact that you have 2 daughters born in the US may not really be looked at or considered. If it is, I would be prepared with an answer. I would be prepared to address it head on, to acknowledge it, and also to establish your ties outside of the country. So while I don't think it's really a strong basis to deny, I would anticipate the questions. And John, let me know if you disagree with that.
No, I agree.
As a Canadian citizen, do you suggest land port or over airport? That depends on the circumstances of the application. We would work with our clients to really talk through the specific port of entry. That's ideal. If I have an LLC, someone could employ me in the US. Can you repeat that? There is no prohibition to you owning the company in Mexico or Canada that is engaged for the TN visa. So let's take an example. Let's say, going back to my solar panel example, let's say that you are a Canadian, you have an LLC in Canada or the equivalent in Canada, where you provide consulting services on solar panels. And there is a US company that you do not own that produces solar panels. They want to hire you. They essentially can hire you and contract you through your Canadian company. There's no prohibition on you owning that Canadian company. You would present the letter from the US company to the border official or port of entry official or at the Mexican consulate and explain that I have a US company that wants to engage me as an independent contractor. I work for a company in Canada. I'm being engaged as an independent contractor to come here and provide consulting services. There's no prohibition on that. You cannot own the US company, however. All right, let's see. While you hold a TN visa, are you allowed to study here in the US pursuing a master's degree? I believe so. I don't think there's a prohibition on studying in the US on a TN visa. John, is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, that's my understanding. One thing that might come up if you're, I mean, I don't see how it might come up in the application process, but you want to just be wary that sometimes an officer may scrutinize time constraints. So especially more relevant to 2 or 3 different TN cases, how are you going to be able to work all those jobs, or in this case, going to school and then working your job? So technically, I don't think it's an issue, but logistically, if you have a difficult officer, he may make an issue of it. So you may need to be ready to explain.
Perfect. And then the final question here, I'm in Africa. Can I apply for a TN visa to work in US or Canada? The TN visa that we've been talking about is to work in the US. You must be a citizen of either Canada or Mexico. You can be a dual citizen. And if you're living in the DRC, but you're a national of Canada or Mexico, that's fine. In terms of nationality, the requirement is that you be a national of Canada or Mexico. All right, we are at 12:01, John. So I think we're right at the limit. This has been a really great discussion, great questions. Thank you all for taking the time to attend and share those great questions. John, thank you for sharing your expertise. We do hope that we see you all on future webinars, and do reach out if we can be of any further help. Thanks and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.